Need a relatively quick-fire guide to key features of the Gothic? You're in the right place. Stay tuned, this is a Schofield on Shakespeare guide to the Gothic. There are generally thought to be two principal Gothic periods. The first period began with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, published in 1764, and lasted until around 1830. Gothic texts from this period also include Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, Matthew Lewis's The Monk, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There was also then a second key Gothic period in the late 19th century, which included texts such as Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. There are, of course, plenty of Gothic texts written in both the 20th and early 21st century. Well-known ones include Susan Hill's The Woman in Black and Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. The atmosphere within Gothic texts is typically tense, and there is an anticipation of terror. For example, Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles, first published in 1902, builds up tension through detailed description of Dartmoor in Devon, particularly at night. Sir Henry Baskerville has returned to his ancestral home, unperturbed by reports of his family being cursed by the presence of a murderous supernatural hound. In chapter 14, Detective Sherlock Holmes and dim sidekick Watson believe that a man by the name of Stapleton may be behind the supposedly supernatural appearance of this hound, and so they lie in wait outside his home. With Sir Henry's life in danger, Doyle writes,
"Every minute that white woolly plain which covered one half of the moor was drifting closer and closer to the house. Already the first thin wisps of it were curling along the golden square of the lighted window. The furthest wall of the orchard was already invisible, and the trees were standing out of a swirl of white vapour. As we watched it, the fog wreaths came crawling round both corners of the house and rolled slowly into one dense bank, on which the upper floor and the roof floated like a strange ship upon a shadowy sea. Holmes struck his hand passionately upon the rock in front of us and stamped his feet in his impatience. 'If he isn't out in a quarter of an hour, the path will be covered. In half an hour we won't be able to see our hands in front of us.' Tension is built up through the close description of the fog, which threatens to make it impossible for both Holmes and Watson to see more than a metre in front of them, thus making it extremely hard for them to see and catch their suspect. Doyle's simile of a roof floating like a strange ship upon a shadowy sea helps create an ethereal, otherworldly atmosphere, which is also typical of the Gothic and seen in other texts, including Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Gothic texts, especially those from the late 18th and early 19th century, typically present castles, monasteries or rambling mansions with secret passages in which victims, typically women, can be trapped and are vulnerable. In Anne Radcliffe's exhaustingly long 1794 novel The Mysteries of Udolpho, Emily St. Aubert is trapped within the remote castle of Udolpho by her disreputable Italian nobleman uncle Montoni. In chapter 6 from volume 2, it is late at night and Emily is struggling to sleep. However, in the silence of the night, she hears a sound that seems to have come from her own chamber. Radcliffe writes,
"A return of the noise again disturbed her. It seemed to come from that part of the room which communicated with the private staircase, and she instantly remembered the odd circumstance of the door having been fastened during the preceding night by some unknown hand. Her late alarming suspicion concerning its communication also occurred to her. Her heart became faint with terror. Half raising herself from the bed and gently drawing aside the curtain, she looked towards the door of the staircase, but the lamp that burnt on the hearth spread so feeble a light through the apartment that the remote parts of it were lost in shadow. The noise, however, which she was convinced came from the door, continued. It seemed like that made by the undrawing of rusty bolts, and often ceased, and was then renewed more gently, as if the hand that occasioned it was restrained by a fear of discovery. The light from the lamp is desperately weak, and Emily's vulnerability is highlighted in her earlier decision to sleep in her clothes. Could her prized virginity be stolen from her during this terrifying late-night raid?
Gothic writers tend to be more interested in characters motivated by strong passions rather than strictly rational or moral thoughts. In chapter 5 of Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein beholds the creature that he has feverishly created using body parts stolen from graves and charnel houses. Victor's passionate reaction to his creature's first few moments of life is worth revisiting.
How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavoured to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same colour as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shrivelled complexion and straight black lips. His passionate revulsion is seen within the incredulous phrasing of the initial rhetorical question. The short exclamations of "beautiful," "great God," and appalled close description of the contrast between the potentially positive, lustrous black hair, pearly white teeth, and the macabre, porous yellow skin and dun-white sockets.
Gothic writers share an interest beyond the human in the suspected supernatural. Whereas in Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, the supposedly supernatural events have rational explanations. The ghost in Susan Hill's 1983 novel, The Woman in Black, is real and causes the death of the narrator's wife and child. Describing the atmosphere within the haunted Eel Marsh house within the chapter entitled Whistle and I'll Come to You, our narrator Kipps writes,
Then from somewhere, out of that howling darkness, a cry came to my ears, catapulting me back into the present and banishing all tranquillity. I listened hard. Nothing. The tumult of the wind, like a banshee, and the banging and rattling of the window in its old, ill-fitting frame. Then yes, again, a cry. That familiar cry of desperation and anguish, a cry for help from a child somewhere out on the marsh. There was no child. I knew that. How could there be? Yet how could I lie here and ignore even the crying of some long-dead ghost? Rest in peace, I thought, but this poor one did not, could not. Atmospheres of fear pervade Gothic texts, and in this extract there is the terror of the unexplained and of the unknown. What is the cry? Where is it coming from? Why is it in such anguish? Gothic texts explore the boundaries of our human experience and defy rational logic. On the one hand, it is not possible for there to be a living child out on that marsh on that particular night. But if that is the case, how then can we explain the very real cry for help?
Gothic writers favour wild weather and nighttime settings. Daphne du Maurier's 1936 novel, Jamaica Inn, is about Mary, a young woman who ends up trapped, living with her brutal uncle and downtrodden aunt. In the exciting climax to the novel, she is forced to travel to the coast to witness her uncle and his men attempting to wreck a ship in order to plunder its booty. She tries in vain to escape.
A wall of fog closed in upon her, obscuring the distant line of hedge for which she had been making, and she stopped at once in her headlong rush, aware of the danger of sea mist, and how in its deception it might bring her back to the lane again. She fell at once upon hands and knees and crawled slowly forward, her eyes low to the ground, following a narrow, sandy track that wound in the direction she wished to take. Her progress was slow, but instinct told her that the distance was increasing between her and the pedlar, which was the only thing that mattered. She had no reckoning of time. It was 3, perhaps 4 in the morning, and the darkness would give no sign of breaking for many hours to come. Once more the rain came down through the curtain of mist, and it seemed as though she could hear the sea on every side of her, and there was no escape from it. The breakers were muffled no longer. They were louder and clearer than before. In Gothic texts, nighttime settings and wild weather consort to frighten and to hamper and thwart the attempts of good characters to escape the clutches of evil. In the extract shown on screen, the lack of visibility and light actually results in Mary moving towards, rather than away from, her brutal uncle and his violent, motley band.
Many Gothic texts feature strong, scheming men with secrets, who attempt to control and often abuse women under their care. In Wilkie Collins's 1859 novel The Woman in White, there are two very different, strong and scheming men. One is the charismatic Count Fosco. The other is the far less charming, desperate Sir Percival Glyde. Together, the two men come up with an outrageous identity swap plan in order to access Sir Percival's wife's money. Poor, innocent and rather dull Laura will not only be passed off as unknown pauper Anne Catherick, but also committed to a mental asylum as mad. Marion Halcombe, Laura's half-sister, ingeniously and determinedly manages to gain access to this mental asylum and successfully manages to rescue her. Ironically, Laura's suffering during her marriage to Sir Percival and subsequently at the mental asylum results in the loss of her looks and beauty, so that she is more likely to be taken to be this other woman.
The sorrow and suffering which I had once blamed myself for associating even by a passing thought with the future of Laura Fairley had set their profaning marks on the youth and beauty of her face, and the fatal resemblance which I had once seen and shuddered at seeing, in idea only, was now a real and living resemblance which inserted itself before my own eyes. Strangers, acquaintances, friends even, who could not look at her as we looked, as if she had been shown to them in the first days of her rescue from the asylum, might have doubted if she were the same Laura Fairley they had once seen, and doubted without blame. The narrator's reaction highlights just how much Laura has suffered. She hasn't just lost her youth and beauty, but there are marks on her face which are profaning, so severe that they feel almost against God and the natural order of things. So, 6 features of Gothic texts. Firstly, the idea that the atmosphere within Gothic texts is typically tense and there is an anticipation of terror. Secondly, the idea that Gothic texts, especially those from the late 18th and early 19th century, will present castles, monasteries or rambling mansions with secret passages in which victims, typically women, can be trapped and are vulnerable. Thirdly, Gothic writers tend to be more interested in characters motivated by strong passions rather than strictly rational or moral thoughts. Fourthly, Gothic writers share an interest beyond the human in the suspected supernatural. Fifthly, Gothic writers favour wild weather and nighttime settings. Sixthly, many Gothic texts feature strong, scheming men with secrets who attempt to control and often abuse women under their care.
But this is not an exhaustive list. From your own reading and research, what other key features of Gothic texts would you draw attention to? If you're particularly keen, why not post them within the comments section of this video? Those of you interested in exploring Gothic texts in more detail may like to see some of my other videos. My ultimate A-level revision guide to Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, an exploration of madness in 19th century literature, my pre-U A-level revision guide to Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White, the presentation and role of ghosts in Hamlet and Matt Haig's Dead Fathers Club, an A-level pre-U revision guide to Jane Eyre focusing particularly on secrets and deceit, and many others. But for the meantime, this has been a Schofield on Shakespeare guide to the Gothic. Many thanks for watching.